Good morning, good afternoon. This is not evening yet anywhere. To those of you who have signed up for this webinar, my name is Marshall Murray. I'm a judge in Milwaukee County. I'll be joined by my partner in crime, attorney Jennifer White, who's the program director for curriculum development and program design at Futures Without Violence. This is a webinar regarding teen sexting. I like the title, Just Between You and Me, because those are usually the words that someone, either the person who's taking the picture or the person asking for the picture, is saying just between you and me. As a result of this session, you will be better able to discuss the state of the law around teen sexting. You'll be better able to identify the potential harms of teen sexting. And you'll be better able to discuss how a judge can approach these difficult cases both in the court and in individual communities. Now, before we begin, Jen and I thought we might ask you, what is your profession? We want to see who's out there in the audience. Could you let us know? I know I saw one's a social worker, someone from the Army. As you type those in, thank you for doing that. Kelly says she can barely hear the speaker. Can everyone hear me? If you can, please let us know. Hopefully everyone can hear, and hopefully Kelly can hear us better now. The issue is sexting, and the sexting is the practice of sending or posting sexual, suggestive text messages and images, including nude or semi-nude photos via cellular phone or over the internet, has become known as sexting. Now, that's the definition that we'll be working with today. How many of you have had a case with this issue? If you could just answer yes or no. How many of you had to deal with this issue of teen sexting? All right, it looks like most of you have, at least two-thirds of the audience has dealt with this issue. Thank you for those responses.
So, Marshall, I'm actually going to ask you to change the slides because somehow I got booted off of the...
I'm with you, my friend.
Okay. Thank you very much. So I wanted to talk a little bit about prevalence. So you see on the slides that 92% of Americans aged 13 to 17 are online with social media at least once a day. 42% of teens 13 to 18 years old report that their parents know nothing or very little about what they do online. And that 95% of teens report witnessing cruelty or bullying online, with 21% joining in when they saw it. We know this, that kids live very much within a digital world today. Much of their identity is wrapped up in what they do online. Much of their social life is connected to online. So the way that they grow and they engage is very much dictated by their online presence. Sexting, which, as Marshall said earlier, is the practice of sending sometimes nude or semi-nude photos, has become kind of a bit of a controversy in the last, let's say, I would say maybe 7 years or so. About, I think it was around 2013, Futures Without Violence held a summit on the issue, and we had A lot of people from different disciplines come and discuss what to do about the issue. And the reason we were joining together to discuss it was because, well, first of all, the high percentage of kids who were engaged in it, 20% of teen girls and 11% of girls between age of 13 to 16, admitted to having electronically sent or posting nude or semi-nude photos of themselves. And we have lists of resources that we can send you where these statistics come from, and I believe they're on our last slide as well. We'll show you at the end. But because of the fact that it is widespread, and because of the fact that kids were being charged with crimes for it, and that prompted us to examine the issue a little bit further.
And
so
we have
over to Marshall.
Right, and we have a fact scenario that hopefully you've had a chance to read. I'm going to point out some of the highlight points that we want you to focus on. We have Monique X, who's a 10th grader. She's age 15. She went to an emergency room because of a UTI, urinary tract infection, and the doctor at the emergency room noticed that she had a number of bruises on her thighs and torso. The doctor suspected child abuse and called the police. The police started an investigation, and they were focusing in on Monique's father. Monique, who became extremely upset that her father was being at least examined or investigated for the harm to her, she admitted to the police that she had had sex with someone by the name of Chris, and he was her 17-year-old boyfriend. She stated that the sex was consensual, and that's where the bruises originated. The police did not file any charges. That evening, Monique's father called Chris's father and said, look, I'm not going to let Chris see my daughter any longer. Chris then texted all of his friends on the football team a picture of Monique posing nude and referring to Monique as a typical Puerto Rican slut. One boy, Adam, then sent the picture to his friends on the basketball team, and then afterwards the football coach saw a picture and called the principal. Within about 36 hours, 48 students at the school had possession of Monique's picture, and 7 were forwarded, and 7 of them forwarded out further. One parent called the police. Charges were filed against Monique and Chris. Monique told the prosecutors she willingly sent Chris a nude picture of her, but that Chris had threatened that if she didn't send the picture, he threatened her several times that unless she let him do it rough with her. So he got the picture. He then said, look, unless you let me do it rough with you, I'm going to send this picture out. She did what he wanted. She can't believe today that he sent that picture out. Chris admitted to sending the pictures. He apologized. He said he didn't realize that it was illegal. He denies threatening Monique and engaging in a sexual act with transmission and as a result of transmitting the photo. So that's what you have for facts. What additional information would you like to know about the situation before a decision is made? Those of you who have dealt with this issue, what would you like to know?
You can just go ahead and write into the chat box if you have ideas of what else you would like to know about this case. This case is kind of a conglomeration of a lot of different cases that have come out over the last couple of years involving this issue. We have a couple people writing in now.
So do you have all the information that you need before a decision is made?
So one other piece of information is whether the schools are required to report this. Did the schools punish the children? These are some other pieces of information that listeners would like to have about the case before making a determination?
And as you think about this, what do you think the legal response should be? Should it be in the courts, or should it be at the school? That question you asked about, are the schools required to report it?
Another comment asking, what does the statute say?
Good question. And it depends on which state you're in, right?
Absolutely. Federal child pornography transfer charges. This is a child pornography, but Monique is a victim. This is child pornography. Did Monique's father press charges on Chris?
And maybe he did. Maybe there was a diversion. What happened in the district attorney's office, if it got to them?
What steps are the schools taking to protect Monique? Very good comment from Sarah. Most of the times the laws have not caught up with the reality of what is happening. Absolutely, that is a major point of discussion that we had at Futures when we started to look at this.
Let's talk a little bit about, and thank you for those answers, and keep them coming. We will look at them. But let's move on to what are some of the legal responses that we know are happening today?
Right. So, the quick answer is, where this takes place is going to have a big, is going to really determine in a large part what would happen to these kids, right? Because most of the times that these cases have come up, they've been prosecuted in state court, usually in juvenile court. But there have been circumstances where kids have been transferred to adult court and charged as adults, and there have been cases where kids have been required to register as sex offenders because of this. So a lot of this is, as Sarah was saying, the law is not catching up with reality. And a lot of it is the fact that there's really no specificity in the child pornography laws that sort of address this particular issue. So the issue of whether or not there are kids who are taking pictures of themselves usually and sharing them with somebody else, or another kid taking a picture of someone underage and either just having it between the two of them or sharing it broadly. And then, of course, the issue of whether or not it was consensual and whether or not it was initially consensual and then later became non-consensual in terms of the sharing, right? So it's a complicated matter, and people, the legal community is all over the map on it, and the states have really tried to address it by introducing legislation over the last, let's say, 7 to 10 years. And most of the legislation involves lessening the penalties. So creating diversionary programs or putting an age gap provision similar to like statutory rape laws where, if the incident occurs between kids within a certain number of years of each other, that's really to get at the fact of, is this happening between two kids or is this an adult taking advantage of a child, right? And then also lessening it to a misdemeanor or a civil matter. And then the other area that the legislation has gone into is ordering studies of the issue. So really looking at what is the impact of sexting and what are the best ways to handle it, and imposing requirements for the schools to do different kinds of education around it. Now, that being said, it's just a couple of months ago in May, the House of Representatives, the U.S. House of Representatives, passed H.R. 1761, which would subject kids to up to 15 years in federal prison and for sexting. And not only does it include the actual transmission of images or of nude or semi-nude images or images really of a sexual nature is the way that they would explain it, sexually explicit conduct, that type of thing. So there's a question as to would it be just nude or semi-nude, or would it require more? But the law also includes attempts. So if one person was to go to another person and request or try to coerce someone to send a picture, that would be covered. That would be included in this law, as well as conspiracy. So, if you look at sort of the situation with that you hear in schools a lot, where there was a picture that was sent and then it was distributed widely, or two kids got together to sort of do something to intimidate or coerce another kid and got a picture and then distributed it, or maybe didn't distribute it but took the picture. That all would be covered, and could also be covered because of the conspiracy side of the law. So that passed the House, so we're not sure where that's going to go. And then also in Ohio recently, there was just a law passed that is actually hoping to lessen the charges, so go in the opposite way than the federal law. So it's interesting because when we talked about doing this presentation, there was some discussion about whether or not this is still kind of like a hot topic. And as we were preparing, this law that just got, this legislation just got passed the House popped up, and I thought, okay, well, it's still really on the minds of folks, and it's still an issue. So also criminal charges. So prosecutorial response, most of the response has focused on prosecutions. As I mentioned, state and federal law really doesn't distinguish on the age of a person when looking at child pornography. So the child pornography laws were really not intended to cover, as an example, a young person taking a picture of him or herself, right? But because there's no age distinction in the law, these are the laws that have been used to file charges against youth that have been found sexting. And there's a quote here from Judge Philip Trumpeter of Roanoke, who was in one of the big cases on sexting, and he says, the statute is meant to protect children from exploitation, even if the children are the ones exploiting themselves.
So children or teens found with child pornography, a number of things can happen with them as far as criminal charges. They can be charged with felonies. There's certain cases, recent cases, where the state law requires them to come into the juvenile courts. Some of them have taken them out of the juvenile courts and put them in adult courts. Generally, juveniles who commit crimes get convicted of, as Jen said, delinquencies like disorderly conduct or lewdness, with an opportunity to have their record expunged. There's no actual crime committed. It could result in adult charges and penalties, including time behind bars, especially if it's sent to the adult court if they're prosecuted as adults, and required to register as sex offenders, which could have long-term effects because it's for 20 years. It could impact their abilities regarding employment, school admissions now. If you're applying to colleges, they want to know if you had any prior felonies. That could preclude you from getting into the college or getting any financial aid. Sentencing enhancements, if you get caught with another offense later on in life, they could use that against you. We talked a little bit already about sex offender registration, but that could impact your ability to be around children of certain ages. It could even impact you as a parent. Have the right to have children or to be custodian of children or to adopt. It could also impact your eligibility for military services. I know that we have someone in the audience who's from the military. They're probably very much aware of that. Felons can't possess firearms. And again, I already mentioned the ability to adopt or to be a foster parent. And having been a former foster parent, I can tell you that the criteria is very strict. So they're not going to let someone who has a sex offender label on them. It's almost like having the letter red or the letter A tattooed on you. It's not going to happen anymore. You're going to lose out on the benefit of a lot of things. So are we really protecting the teenager? What are we doing here?
So just a note about the Sex Offender Registration and Notification Act. So in a lot of cases, the answer is it depends whether or not a kid who is convicted of sexting is going to be subject to SORNA, the Sex Offender Registration. Usually you have to be 14 years or older, plus the crime has to be one equivalent to a pretty serious sexual offense. So it really depends on what the what the specifics of the case are and what they are charged with to know whether or not they will be subject to the sex offender registration, and again, if they're 14 years or older. But the other thing is if it is left up to the different jurisdictions under SORNA whether kids will be charged as juveniles, right, and adjudicated delinquent, or if they can be transferred to adult court. So if they are transferred to adult court, then they will have to register as sex offenders. So that's a serious matter. Marshall already went over some of the impacts there. So, they could be transferred to adult court either because of the nature of the offense or under prosecutorial and or judicial discretion. So there are a number of cases where a child or a youth could be transferred and then would be subject to SORNA.
Yeah, here in Wisconsin, someone could be charged as a juvenile and then waived to adult court because of the child's history, who they are, what their past is, or they're close to a certain age, and the court could decide to waive that teenager into adult court where they would not have the benefits of the juvenile justice system.
So I just want to point out, Jennifer just added a comment that I did not know about, which is saying that she works for the passport agency and they have been discussing noting sexual offenses in your passport as well. So that's an additional consequence that we did not have listed.
Now there are times, Jen, right, that we have civil actions, and someone asked a question, asked about the father bringing charges against Chris. That could be, if they could bring civil actions against Chris or ask for prosecution. What about the civil side, Jen?
Oh, right. So, so in terms of what has happened around the country, there have been civil rights actions against prosecutors, actually, who have brought cases against girls for this. So you can see here a little bit about Miller v. Skumonic, in which case the prosecutor was enjoined from bringing the criminal action against 3 young girls who had taken a picture of themselves in some new fashion. And actually, I think somebody else took the picture, and the picture was distributed. And this prosecutor tried to force the girls to enroll in a class, and they sued in a Section 1983 action, and this prosecutor was enjoined from further prosecuting them. So there have been civil actions. There's also been civil suits for against schools for not doing enough to deal with the repercussions or to deal with the actual activity among students. So in this terrible case that's listed here is Jessica Logan, who actually committed suicide because of a sexting incident, and the parents did sue the school. So there's also cases of tort liability, intentional infliction of emotional distress or negligent infliction, as well as injunctions and protection orders. So that's just to say that this issue has resulted in a large body of legal action, both civil and criminal, around the country, being handled very differently depending on where you go, and now being taken up by the House of Representatives. So it's definitely something that still remains in flux.
And I see you have control back of your screen again.
Yes. Thanks to Patricia. I do have control back. So just a little bit of a further discussion about why this has come up for us in this field, those of us who work on matters related to domestic and sexual violence and stalking, and have interactions with youth and the court system. And it's because this conversation has really focused on criminal responses. It hasn't really looked at the fact that sexting can be potentially part of a package of coercive controlling behavior in intimate relationships. So we did allude to it in the case that we gave you, right? So the young lady sent the picture, or at least arguably sent the picture because she was coerced to do so. And and this is a situation that we have great concern about, as sexting being coercion as being part of a larger package of behaviors that could be happening in dating violence or other, bullying type relationships amongst young people. Usually there's really no account for the subject of the photos, which overwhelmingly are teenage girls as victims. So a lot of the young girls around the country, if you follow the cases, they got in just as much trouble as the people who distributed the photos. So that's something that we definitely have concerns about, particularly in the cases where young people may be the victims of violence. And what the research shows is that 52% of teens who experience digital abuse are also being physically abused. So there is some overlap, right? There is some co-occurrence, and it's something that we should be concerned about. So, the other piece about this is, and if you read a lot of the law review articles, the tension here is between those that are very concerned about the placing of these types of images into the sphere where it can be accessed by people who are exploiting children, right? So is this behavior expanding the marketplace for sexual predators, right? So that's on the one hand, a real concern and interest in limiting the marketplace of these images, okay? And then on the other hand are people that say, okay, well, this is largely normal behavior that kids are demonstrating at within a certain age group, right? And if we are charging kids for this behavior, we're really not accounting for normal cognitive, emotional, physical, sexual adjustments and changes that all adolescents go through. So that's really where the sort of discourse diverges for lots of different people who are trying to figure out what to do about these cases and how best to handle them. Some of the questions that we really thought about and that we urged people who are working with young people or working within the legal community on these cases is to really think about victimization versus consent. So to really determine, is there a victim and who are they? Is this something where two kids sort of innocently shared a picture of each other, or is this a circumstance where there was coercion, or is this a circumstance where, as I said earlier, initially it was consensual, but later on it became a matter of bullying, a matter of harassment, that type of thing. We really urge people who are dealing with these cases to think about how to account for that piece around coercion, particularly in cases where there might also be other types of abuse and lack of consent. And then also, is it legally sound to use these laws to prosecute these kids? Is that really the intention of the laws that exist? So thinking through some of these questions really will help inform our response.
And there's some thoughts that we want to share with the judges, but if there's a judge in your community who's not able to be online with us today, please share this information with your judge. Legal scholars really are emphasizing that judges should really use their discretion in teen sexting cases. There's a case-by-case analysis that we ask judges to look at the context of what's happening in the relationships, what is the teen's intent and motivations for sexting. It could vary from case by case. Each incident requires a tailored response depending on what's going on. We know that sometimes the intent could be a voluntary sharing of information. It could be teenagers experimenting. Those of you who are not teenagers on this line, I think most of you are not teenagers, but you might remember back when you were younger, just about the thoughts that you had. We talk about teen brain development and, what teens are thinking about. And I'm not talking about hormones running wild. I'm talking about the natural order of things where the brain, the frontal lobe is not fully developed, the brakes don't go on, that's where the brakes are, and people experiment. They try things out. Also, there could be exploitation. We find that most of the time what's going on, Jen gave you some figures, that 52% is some correlation between what's happening with the sexting and what may be going on regarding abuse or violence within the relationship. This coercive behavior could be retaliation or could be trying to get revenge, or it's profit-making and controlling. Jen talked about that. But we need to focus on what could be the harm to the teens. In the courtroom, the judge should assess each teen sexting case individually, as I stated before, to determine what harm would come to that individual and whether the sexting is part of a broader pattern of cyberbullying. What's happening in this child's life that she would do this? And judges also have the important role to play in the broader community by going out and teaching the community and going to the schools, going to Rotary clubs, speaking to fellow judges, educating the community, just as we have done regarding domestic violence. We need to educate the community regarding this issue so that people understand what's really happening. And I'm just going to say it one more time, we ask the judges to assess each case individually to determine the intentions of the sexting teen and what's going on in that person's mind. Why did they send it? We started off with the question, just between you and me. That's what they thought it was going to be. And then it ends up being something else that's a little bit more egregious, at least criminally, the way that people might look at it. So we ask the judges consider in their assessment any significant age differences amongst the participants. As in the Monique case, Monique is 15 or 17, not that much of a difference. At least initially, it looks like it could be an innocent case of to tell Chris, this is how much I love you. I'm going to share this picture with you. But clearly he wanted it for other reasons. The extent of the distribution, what Chris did with it afterwards, and he's liable for how far it goes once he puts it out there. The presence of abusive or coercive behavior. His behavior is a bit coercive in the sense that he got the picture and then said to Monique, look, if you don't have rough sex with me, I'm going to distribute this picture. Any prior incidents of sexting on the part of Chris or on the part of Monique? Did she do this? Is this her first time going into this area? Is this the first time she thought about doing it? What was her intent? Why did she do this? What was his intent? And the level of understanding by the participants of potential harm of sexting. As we now know from Jen, that a lot of these teenagers don't know that it's illegal. They think that they're just participating in something that's going on. I managed a soccer camp for many years, and we were at a college campus where we had these buildings that they were in. The boys were in one building, the girls were in another building, they were facing each other. And I'm sorry to say that I learned that at one particular day the boys were displaying themselves to the girls across the quad, and the girls were displaying themselves in the window across the quad. Why they would do that, I have no idea, but clearly we had to have an educational session with all the boys and girls at the camp and try to explain to them why this was not a good behavior. So you want to consider what's going on and why somebody might be doing this.
Marshall, can I add one thing
Sure.
about this? I want to fill in just one piece of information. So some judges around the country have actually really use their discretion when dealing with these cases to get kids to learn more about the issue. So what we've read about is judges who have turned around and said, go back to your school and do a survey and then ask how many kids know that sexting is legal and what are the harms of sexting, and then come give me a report on it, that type of thing. And that was something that happened in Ohio. And there's been other similar leadership activities that judges have done around this around the country to really push the emphasis more to an educational prevention side rather than an intervention punishment thing.
That's a good point, Jen. We also want judges and others as well to determine whether the exchange of photos was consensual, intended to be private. You know, what was going on in that child's mind at the time that she sent the picture? What was going on in his mind or the child's mind when that person asked for the picture? Ask teens to send photos of themselves if they have felt pressure in relationship to exchange in other behaviors like we had with Monique and Chris. And what is the dynamics, as pointed out by Jen, the dynamics of power and control that we see in adults now seeing displayed, and we know that with teen dating, there can be abusive and issues of power and control and domination. We see that in adolescent relationships as well, and sexting can be a component of that. We want judges to determine whether the distribution of the photos included derogatory or abusive language against the person. When Chris sent it out, what was attached to it? What did he say about her? He called her a slut. Clearly that was derogatory and abusive and hurtful. Did the person distributing the photos do so to harm or humiliate the person in the photo? Clearly he was upset because he couldn't see her anymore. The father had cut off that relationship, so he was going to take it out on Monique. Assess whether the participants have engaged in other bullying behaviors, meaning particularly the perpetrator of the sending out the photos. What do we know about them? Have they done other bullying behaviors? Have they displayed that behavior that could be attributed to what they're doing now, and harassing someone digitally and cyberbullying?
And I would tell you that a lot of what's happening around the states are really, for the most part, doing some good stuff around this. And the response, a lot of it takes into account what we're talking about. Looking at, is this sort of the first time it's happened? Was it something that was done consensually, or was it something that was done to harass or embarrass, that type of thing? So around the country, there is some good work now being done, and states are trying to address the matter. And for the most part, as I said, are trying to lessen the penalties, not give more harsh penalties for kids. But we'll see what happens with the federal legislation. We're not really sure where that will go. We have, these are some of our sources that we used for the presentation. And then in addition, I would like to recommend to you, if you want to read more about the various responses to this issue, Futures Without Violence has a guide that we created. And we wrote it a few years ago, but it's really still relevant today and has a lot of good resources in it. So it's a sexting guide for judges and other legal professionals. And it's on our website, Futures Without Violence. And I can also send it to you, or I can send it to Patricia probably, and perhaps Patricia might be able to share it with you guys if you have interest.
And I would ask that the judges and all of you to collaborate together, pull people together, have the judges call a meeting. What's going on in your community? How can you address this issue? What are other ways to assure that teenagers are not penalized to the point where they can be harmed later on in life, but maybe get the services that they need now, maybe counseling, it could be education. How can we help them so that we're not harming them? Does anyone have any questions that they would like to ask of Jen or myself?
We have some people typing. I see somebody requesting a copy of the guide, and and we can definitely get that for you. Different education what are some of the best deterrent and education resources you recommend? So a lot is being done all over the country on the deterrent piece of it and educationally. A lot of schools are taking it upon themselves to create education programs that involve a lot of work with kids to do things like research papers or surveys or interviews or things like that. But there are so many resources now on the web of different community-based organizations and nonprofits that are working more on the parent response and the school response. So I can get you some of those, a list of some of those as well, and I will.
Also, did I believe that Futures Without Violence, there's a group there that's working with teens?
Oh, right. So that you're talking about that's not cool?
Right.
Yeah, so great reminder, Marshall. Thank you. That's Not Cool.com is a project that Futures Without Violence hosts, and it is really it's a website for kids, and it helps them. There's a place where they can chat and discuss if they're experiencing digital harassment or if they're getting requests by peers for pictures that make them uncomfortable, that kind of thing. They have something called call-out cards that they can send to people that are kind of sort of funny responses to requests for nude pictures. But there's also like videos that the kids do themselves and can share online so that they have this sort of place to really put their voice out there and say what they're thinking, what they're struggling with. So that's something too that has been very positive. We've gotten really positive response and it's around education, but it's more peer education versus the school or the community.
Any other questions?
We have time if anybody has any questions.
We do want to thank each and every one of you for attending this webinar today. We hope that this is just the beginning of the discussion in your community. And we'd like to know, the National Council would like to know, how they can help out, what resources they can bring to you. If your judges are not members of the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges, we'd like to ask them, suggest that you get them to join, because there's a lot of good information out there for judges. The oldest judicial group in the country. And if judges have any questions, they're welcome to contact me as well if they want to talk judge to judge.
And I'm going to put in my my email address into the chat box for folks. If anybody wants to contact me directly about this, since we've done a lot of thought, we've had a lot of thinking around it and writing and discussion. So if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to answer your questions.
And Jen's the best person to ask.
Thanks, Marshall.
You're welcome, Jen.
Well, thank you all for being here today. It was wonderful to spend some time with everybody talking about this.
Okay, I think Patricia.
Patricia, did you have anything you wanted to?
Yeah, so just in a few moments, I see a few people asking, and I received a few emails as well. You are able to request a certificate of attendance after completing the evaluation. So when I end the webinar in just a few moments, the survey will come up automatically on everyone's screen. And then after you complete it, you can just enter your first and last name as well as an email address, and we will get that sent out to everyone.
Great. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.
Have a great day.